Live from Austin, Texas, and
Rockville, Maryland. This is another episode of the legendary Charlie and Andrei podcast.
we're here to continue our conversation on the Byzantine Empire, specifically on the reign of Emperor Justinian. And we'll wrap up the conversation that we left off on our last episode and end on his enduring influence since his time.
Right. So last time we covered some of the basic historic outline of the reign of Justinian. Basically, he started out under his uncle, but was working behind the scenes, basically running things even before he started. Of course, soon after he started, the Nika riots happened in the Hippodrome, in which many thousands of people were killed because of the way he mismanaged it. Then he started a war against these Western Germanic barbarian kingdoms. First, the Vandals in North Africa. He sent his trusted general Belisarius, his boy, to go whoop ass, and they did pretty easily. Then he went up the boot of Italy, took down the Goths pretty quickly, but things were not so simple there because he left and didn't leave enough men, and basically they had to come back, and they were locked in this protracted struggle over the next 20-something years. The loss of the life of many Italians, Goths, and Byzantines, which is pretty sad and led to a lot of problems as Italy declined from its once former glory as the jewel of the Mediterranean. And then of course the plague also happened, which killed many, millions of people. This is like the first Black Plague, so had a lot of drama. He and his wife Theodora, if you recall, being this power couple that basically ran everything, and they made a good team. But as we'll see here, there was a lot of drama with some of the people in their lives. So the histories are basically written by this guy Procopius, who was an official in the Byzantine Empire at the time. He was from Caesarea. He also was a lawyer. He came along on a lot of the campaigns and had firsthand kind of knowledge of the goings on in the court of Justinian, Belisarius, all that. He painted them in a very negative light, like they were basically like demons, something like that. Like they're these depraved, power-hungry individuals who backstabbed each other all the time and took advantage of the common people and all that. And it's hard to really say what the truth was and all that because he was biased himself. One of the interesting things he writes about is the affairs of Antonina, the wife of Belisarius, the hero of the military. Even though he was like this badass who was doing all this stuff, very humbly for Justinian, she was not very faithful to him. In fact, I think one of the stories was that this godson that they adopted, basically named Theodosius, he was a handsome young Thracian, I believe, referred to. She had an affair with him. He was much younger than Belisarius, but basically half of the army on his campaign was aware of this, but he himself supposedly was not. So I don't know if Procopius intentionally tried to portray Belisarius as being naive and kind of gullible in that respect, but he apparently always stayed faithful to her. But yeah, she often cheated on him. They often schemed behind his back. She and her Theodora, the empress, were often were usually friends. They had a bit of a fraught relationship at times. In fact, I think someone actually found out about that guy Theodosius that she's having an affair with, that they adopted, and then Theodora actually hid him in the palace from everybody else. and this might seem like she was basically helping out her friend or covering for her, but she might have been trying to make her politically in debt to her more. So not always altruistic here. But it just goes to show you that there's a lot of drama and like love triangles, all kinds of things, even in a time like this.
Yeah, it's interesting. Procopius kind of gives us kind of the back history, and that's why he titles it the Secret History, where he counts for all those scandals occurring, during Justinian's reign and his wife Theodora. He also wrote another book, The Wars of Justinian, where he kind of detailed the military campaigns of Justinian in detail. Especially like you said, he was present for all of those. It's interesting. You're almost tempted to believe what Procopius says, because he actually does say there were some positive things. He talks about the legal reforms, like the Code of Justinian. He talks about the codification efforts and like the compilation of the laws and the digest that ended up being Corpus Juris Civilis. And he says that was good. But he also kind of gives like another balance to that, saying that there was a lot of taxation that was really burdensome, and that Justinian was imposing that on the population. Wasn't necessarily the best thing, but it just goes to show like Procopius wasn't 100% negative. He was just trying to paint, or what we assume to paint, as an honest account of what was going on. So that's why he's pretty persuasive, because he's not just all negative. He also has some really interesting things to say for things which he was actually present for.
That's right, because you don't often get this level of first person, eyewitness to events being also the author of the histories. A lot of later Byzantine works written by people several centuries after the fact, or people only sort of maybe tangentially kind of related to the events, but not directly involved in them. And a lot of other periods of history we have very scant evidence for. So this is actually a pretty interesting and wealthy era in terms of like our primary sources. And Procopius was not the only one. There were some others as well that we can use to kind of fill in the gaps and put the pieces together of what really happened. Of course, some of these things will always be subject to interpretation. It's impossible to get a truly objective view of everything, but I would say, I mean, Procopius definitely spices things up. He makes things interesting at the very least, like.
Yeah, it brings a lot of life into what has already been a very interesting and action-packed filled regime. Like you said, all those things that Justinian had to deal with, from the Nika factors to dealing with the Vandals to his law reforms, his major construction projects that we may want to touch on more, and the reconquest of the Western Roman Empire. So it's exciting and relevant things even to modern day.
Yeah, and get into that in a little bit. I do want to touch on some of his religious legacy and like his attempts sort of reconciling different sects, because at the time there was this big split between the Nicene Orthodox Christianity and this other sort of sect or belief called the Monophysites, who believed in a singular nature of Christ as opposed to the dual nature, the divine and the human, as represented by the Trinity. So to us, they might seem like minor distinctions, but to them, that made a big difference. And this has been like a sort of a rift for the last like century or so. One of the previous emperors at the turn of the last century, like around 500 AD, tried to create he did a huge meeting of all these different sects called the Henoticon, and that was his attempt at sort of building compromise, but it didn't really hold. And Justinian saw the strategic value of bringing them together, but he just never really pulled it off, which is unfortunate, because that was actually one of the bigger problems of his reign. But because like unfortunately these rifts like can continue to go, and then as we'll see during this next century, these divisions will become bigger, and a lot of them would fall under the sway of the Arabs that conquered the Middle East and wouldn't be as uh, they didn't desire as much of a link with Constantinople as they would have if they were, the same type of Christianity. So some interesting things
Yeah.
kind of happen there.
It's interesting to note that a lot of these religious disputes, whether it be Monophysitism or, the Council of Constantinople in like 381 or the Nicene Creed, Council of Nicaea in 325,
That
a
was
lot of this kind of goes down to religious disputes having major economic, issues.
Yep.
And it has a major impact on, how trade is conducted, because if there's a ban from one section of the polity in the Roman Empire that's trading with another, that's going to have major economic influences that can have ripple effects.
Oh yeah, always follow the money. I mean, behind all this, there's the religious aspect, of course. It's the spiritual aspect was a lot more important for them back then than it is for us today. But of course, there's always like real politics underneath this, and a lot of times it had to do with money, power, and influence. So
Yeah,
the church was a way, of course, of establishing a form of control. Like Nicene Christianity was promulgated by the state, and it was a form of social control by Constantinople, enforcing its culture and values. That can't be understated. So this was a bit of a failure in his legacy, but he does, on the other hand, gain, a lot of points for the fact that he constructed one of the, marvels of the ancient medieval world, the Hagia Sophia, the church in Constantinople, which is basically the bastion of all Orthodoxy and one of the most, impressive and beautiful buildings ever made. Um, so he ordered engineers to do this over a series of years, but he was actually able to finish it relatively quickly. Interestingly, from what I read, originally there were some issues with structural integrity, and like because of the way they were building it, like it collapsed, like the dome
right.
didn't stay intact at first, but they had to rebuild it in a better way, and eventually, and then that's when we got the one that we still see standing to this day. Now, obviously, it has Turkish minarets around it, but that's always been a point of contention and all that. But
It is interesting, just that hollow dome structure is, I think, for hundreds of years, it was the largest unsupported dome in the world.
yeah,
So it was definitely a technical and architectural achievement. And I think Justinian is quoted as saying, "Solomon, I have outdone you," referring to the Temple of Solomon. That Hagia Sophia is bigger and grander. So that it's just an interesting. I don't know if that's true, but I've read that quote before. But perhaps he could have said it because he was deeply steeped in, Old Testament and New Testament learning.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, from what I understand, though, for all his faults, Justinian was a fairly religious man in his own way. He believed in it, you know, but obviously a lot of this was also, to some extent self-aggrandizing. He wanted to have this impressive legacy, and he wanted to be the guy to reconquer the West.
Yeah, and what a better way to do that than to build a massive building like the pyramids in Egypt.
Yeah, basically he was harkening back to like the glory of older times in Rome when there were more massive construction projects.
But I think this was bigger than anything that was constructed in Roman
Yeah,
antiquity, right?
it was a different style. This was like
Yeah.
this basilica became the basis for like a lot of early medieval churches, and it was just a huge site of pilgrimage for people all across the Christian world, as far as Western Europe and Britain and the Middle East.
The same way that like Santiago de Compostela is, or Canterbury in England,
yeah,
like Canterbury Tales is about a pilgrimage, right, to go to Canterbury.
right. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. That was, I believe, Paulo Coelho wrote a book about that. Actually, about that. It's a
Well,
pretty
he's a wonderful author. Yeah, I love him.
Yeah, and it's that's deeply important to a lot of people. So yeah, this was a very important, very impressive piece of architecture. Even the enemies of the Byzantines kind of marveled at it, and the Turks obviously though they left it intact. They added some things to it, but they
Yeah.
didn't. So because they had to appreciate it.
It
Um,
was a symbol of the Ottoman Empire to some extent.
that's true because they consider themselves in some ways a successor to the Byzantine, like
Yeah.
in the, but um, but yeah, so he did do that. Um,
Yep.
what else is there? So we can kind of, I guess, go back and like try to draw some parallels between, um, his reign and what's going on in the modern world.
Yeah.
Obviously, we can look at the Nika riots. There was a lot of tension there, different, subsets of their society, tensions kind of boiling over and then mismanaged through maybe what we'd call police brutality today. You know, Justinian kind of went overboard and had a lot of people killed, and there's a crowd crush in the stadium. Um, Obviously, we don't necessarily have like fights erupting in in football or soccer stadiums today, but
Well, there was that the soccer war, right? In Latin America, 1969, the football war or 100 Hours War between El Salvador and Honduras. So, granted, that was
yeah,
a war called a football war, but of course for other reasons, ultimately going back to economic stuff.
yeah, yeah. So a lot of times, like I said, there's other reasons for it,
Yeah.
but just manifested in in the form of like the blues and the greens in the Hippodrome in Justinian's time, but um, there were a lot of social tensions and inequalities and things like that, corruption, kind
Yeah.
of.
I mean,
Um,
similarly, there's the, global health crisis that we experienced with COVID and everything, and they had to deal with the plague there in
yeah,
the 500s. So it kind of just shows you that the world back then was interconnected in a large way to an extent that we are today as well. Um,
yeah.
and we have to mitigate diseases somehow. Um, so another connection between the reign of Justinian and the Byzantine Empire with the modern world.
Because yeah, some historians go back and look at different stages of like, in a way, what they would call proto-globalization. It started as far back in some ways as like the Bronze Age, when like, the Mediterranean, the Middle East was connected through like, trade routes for tin and copper and things like that. And then during the Hellenistic, era after Alexander, the Persian Empire, that grew even bigger, that trade network expanded. And during the Roman Empire, there was a sort of a mini globalization too, where like you could get goods flowing all the way from like Spain, Gaul, and Britain, uh, going to the Eastern Empire from there through the Persian and Parthian empires to the Silk Road, and then from there across all the way to China. And then this era, the era of Justinian, is right after that. So there was still a pretty interconnected world. There had begun to
Yeah.
be some disruption with like the Huns and things like that, and various like Turkic kind of nomads, but it was still very much a world that was tied together. Obviously, it took longer to get to place than it does today, but it's still enough to spread, this terrible illness. And it was basically the same kind of thing that caused the Black Death, in the 1300s.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't think they really understood the theory of germ, of
Oh, of
disease,
course not. Yeah. Yeah.
but they didn't really have like quarantines in the way that we do, but they did take some precautions. After a while, they noticed it spreads, through contact and close, interaction between people.
It
So
would basically be like a form of social distancing. They figured I just don't want to get close to that person who's sick.
yeah, and the emperor himself actually caught it, but he survived. It's interesting. Some
Yeah.
people just had, just were got lucky, had more immunity. Others not so lucky. But from what
Yeah.
I heard, it was a pretty gnarly, pretty gross, you
Yeah.
know, with the giant swelling kind of
It does
pustule.
not sound good. Yeah, it sounds pretty bad.
So, yeah.
You know, another thing that's interesting, it kind of goes beyond parallels, is like the continuity of institutions. I mean, both the Catholic and the Orthodox Church recognized Justinian, and a lot of what he did influences those modern, well, those institutions that exist in the modern era, but have roots to back then.
Oh yeah. Yeah, a lot of things actually do. I mean, obviously you can look at his code of Justinian, which still has profound like impacts on the legal system of many countries today indirectly. But
I mean, ultimately, they just adopted it at some point. A lot of the German principalities adopted it. You know, the Dutch Confederation adopted it, and the English referenced it a lot. And it was just a magnificent codification of a lot of rules that became also the basis for the Napoleonic Code that we use today. Or, well, that we being certain countries use as the basis for their laws today.
100%. Yep. So yeah, you can really trace back like the thread all the way to there. And actually, he himself like compiled earlier laws as we've gone over
Right.
in the episode, but so it can be traced back pretty far. Um, so all in all, yeah, he has a mixed record. A lot of people, the only time they really hear of Justinian, like the average person, might be in their like middle school or high school history class. And it's always in history books, he's always kind of described as like being at the pinnacle or zenith of Byzantine power. And he's one of the few emperors, as a matter of fact, of the Byzantines that's ever actually mentioned in history books compared to like the old Romans themselves. Um, and it's true that like it probably was like sort of the high point of the empire in many ways. Like, yeah, in terms of like wealth, territorial extent, power, the complexity of their society and all the dynamics that are happening at the time. Yeah, it was very interesting, time to be in Constantinople and the empire.
Let me
Things
ask you
changed.
this, Andre. A lot of people refer to it as the Byzantine Empire rather than the Roman Empire, but of course, Justinian would have referred to himself as a Roman emperor, right? Could you
Oh,
clarify maybe what's going on there between that
yeah.
difference?
Byzantine didn't become a word or a term used for the empire until like maybe the 16th century by some kind of German historian who wrote about it, and he used the old Greek name for the city of Constantinople, Byzantium, uh, as a descriptor because he wanted to kind of separate it out from like proper Rome or what he saw as proper Rome, and kind of highlight the more Greek character and aspects of the Eastern Roman Empire. But at the time, they never used anything but Roman to describe themselves. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And we said in the last episode, Justinian himself still spoke Latin. So he was one of the last emperors to do that. After the 6th century, they kind of stopped. But
Yeah. Well, we're kind of low on time, but I was going to mention on a poetic note, you'd mentioned sometimes students interact with Justinian in textbooks. In Dante's Paradiso, which is the book after Purgatorio, and Purgatorio is after the Inferno, he's placed in the sphere of Mercury in the sixth canto of the Paradiso, in that sphere of paradise, and that sphere is reserved for just rulers. So, in Dante's view, he's like praising him for the codification of Roman law
yeah,
and being, continuing and establishing the Roman Empire continually. So I think that it's interesting to consider that in medieval Europe, likely Justinian was praised in a good light if Dante's placing him, because Dante placed a lot of rulers around his time and former times in the Inferno.
that's definitely true. I mean, he probably was seen in a very positive light because they know of his grandiose achievements. That's what history remembered him for. But unfortunately, the way his reign ended shortly after they lost a lot of Italy to another, group of invaders, the Lombards. Spain was eventually soon lost, parts of North Africa. And then by the early 7th century, they started losing the Middle East to the Arabs. after this huge war with the Persians, and all of this I think was because of how much he overspent, trying to do this Western reconquest. So in just a century or less after, like, the Byzantine Empire was in one of its lowest like places, uh, you know,
Yeah.
odd, which is interesting. So a lot of people don't really consider that in hindsight.
Yeah, but then by the same token, if he hadn't conducted this conquest, it's unclear whether the Vandals would have tried to push more towards the empire. And I
Yeah,
mean, he had to kind of evaluate the risks and threats that existed.
yeah, to some extent, yes. So some of it, wasn't maybe necessary. Some of it was just his own personal ambition, mix of the two. But nonetheless, very interesting emperor. I mean, you can at least say that, if nothing else.
Oh,
So,
fascinating. Yeah.
and that just kind of scratches the surface. I'm sure there's a lot more to him, but we just wanted to kind of give like a overview of his life. And um, yeah, we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Andre and Charlie podcast.
Thank
Um,
you for joining our episode.
yeah,
We'll see you
and
next time, hopefully sooner. We know we've been gone for a while, but that's how summer is sometimes.
very true. I hope you
Yep.
guys will join us again next time. Stay
All righty.
tuned. See
Stay
you, bud.
tuned.